Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, both in person and online. I imagine we'll have some folks trickling in into the back. There is food and coffee, anything you need. We will take a short break in the middle so you can hop up and get more refreshments, get what you need, and we will get rolling. One quick change to the agenda. Hodan Omaar is unfortunately sick, COVID in the family, so that will be the one shift, but otherwise we are all set. So first off, good morning. I'm Ellie Graeden. I am a research professor at the Center for Global Health Science and Security here at Georgetown. So at the heart of this, my PhD is in biology, but I'm a data wonk. What I really care about is figuring out how to get data used. And to get data used, we have to figure out how to share it. Especially as a health person and somebody who just came out of pandemic response world, we can't do a whole lot as individuals. We need to somehow be sharing information. We need to be able to share the data that people need when they need it to get done in the world what we need to do. But we can't share it if we don't understand what it is, if we don't have good policy and regulation around privacy, around security, around understanding what can be shared, when, and for whom. So a couple of quick stories that really come at this from both sides. One is, early in the vaccine rollout, I was working with a state governor's office. We needed to know who was vaccinated, who had already been vaccinated, and who hadn't yet been able to be. What they needed to know and what we needed to know, and we're helping them figure out, was where those people were and how we could get them a vaccine van. Where were we going to park it? But the thing is that we were working with a 2003 SQL database, and it was keyed on the individual. That means in practice that you can't actually access any of the information in the database without going to the individual first. But we didn't want to know anybody's names. We didn't need to know anybody's names. We just needed to know a general percentage by neighborhood of who had been vaccinated where. We couldn't get it. We would have needed HIPAA compliance to get access to that database and pull those data out. So it's a really good example for where it's the right privacy regulation, it's the right philosophy, but it's actually preventing us from being able to use the data the way that we need to. On the flip side, some of these regulations end up constraining us in ways that we really do want them to constrain us, and that we're starting to move toward additional constraints. So there was a case just this last week, a suit by the FTC against GoodRx. And in that particular suit, what happened, so GoodRx is a healthcare startup, and they work with a lot of health data. They're HIPAA compliant. The concern was, like most startups, they need to find their customers. And to find their customers, they're selling their data for advertising purposes. It's the way they get your information out. Now, GoodRx wasn't selling the HIPAA compliant data, but they did sell the consumer data. And because they have HIPAA compliance and they're working in the health space, the FTC called them out on it. The issue here is that the policy is relatively unclear, and that as we're shifting into this new domain, it's hard to figure out what that line is and how to structure that effectively. And this is, in practice, with both of these stories, an engineering problem and a policy problem. Now, again, these are both policy or health stories, but they apply across a lot of different domains, whether we're talking about, yes, health, but also financial data. If we're talking about consumer data, we're talking about education data. There are a lot of different privacy and security regulations around all of these different regulatory domains, but especially as data start to move between these domains, we need a new approach. So I'm going to propose two core principles that I think are useful as touch points for ways to think about what the policy needs to be and what our engineering strategies need to be. So the first is that data are growing exponentially. We know that. That's been true for 20 years. But the reality is we're suddenly at a new pitch. As that curve goes up, we are now in the middle of that exponential growth curve. When you look at something like ChatGPT, every time somebody runs a query through, yes, it's combing through vast amounts of existing textual data, but it's generating vast amounts as well. And so what we need are engineering systems and policies that address and handle the fact that there is that exponentially expanding growth. And the blunt reality is we can't keep an infinite amount of anything secure. You can't lock it up in a safe box. You can't build the new safe box for it. Eventually, you run into a problem where there is so much of it that some of it's going to get out. And if you want to be careful about what does or doesn't, we need to start rethinking it. That infinite amount of data, better security and better privacy itself isn't going to solve that problem. The second core principle underlying a lot of this is that data no longer fall in one regulatory bucket. So the way that a lot of privacy regulations are written now, it's health regulation, or it's education regulation around education data, financial data regulation, consumer regulation. What about eye tracking data that come out of a VR headset? Turns out those data are regulated primarily as consumer data, but they're arguably also health data. We knew more than a decade ago, starting about a decade ago, that if you take mouse movements, which people were using to refine their software, you can actually get early diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So this sort of boundary between what is health and what is consumer is messy. We also know that every time you pull out your credit card, you're at a doctor's office, you pull out your credit card to pay your copay. Very often that ends up coming with a healthcare billing code. It's an ICD-10 code. So your credit card company now knows what healthcare you're receiving. So exactly where is that line? HIPAA only constrains data sharing for healthcare providers and insurers. Should it? How do we manage that? So if we're operating in this world where we have an infinitely expanding amount of data, and those data are crossing regulatory buckets or bins, I would suggest we're at a point where we need some new approaches. We need some new paradigms. What we know is that the best regulation and the best policies are written and crafted when it's the policymakers and the people who ultimately get regulated by it. When we look back over the last century at telecommunications policy, what we see is that there are some early days. It's real rough. You end up with some policies that don't necessarily take into account the latest engineering. And then eventually these engineering groups come to the table, they end up in conversations with the policymakers, and you end up with sensical regulation that starts to work and starts to work well. Now again, we're still talking about exponential speed here. It's not just growth and volume, but it's also rate. So we need to be doing this quickly. So that's what this symposium is about. We're bringing together some of the very, very best thinkers from both the engineering side and from the policy side, people who have been designing and building both the engineering systems, but also figuring out how to incorporate the regulations and then craft and design new and better regulation. So that's the conversation we're having here. How do we come up with a new paradigm? How do we start to rethink how we do this, how we implement it, and how do we make it better? So with that, I'd like to introduce Aneesh Chopra. He was the Chief Technology Officer under the Obama White House, first Chief Technology Officer of the US, and is now the president of CareJourney. He's doing a lot of really interesting work with health data and has a lot of experience figuring out how you do this types of private and public sector integration that makes these systems work. So with that, please help me welcome Aneesh.
Thank you, Ellie, for setting the foundation for the conversation today. Of course, many of you saw the State of the Union. You saw that the president laid out once again the objective that we put forward modern regulations to protect the American people. Maybe the language around big tech feels a little bit more political in its charge than perhaps the more narrow technical discussion that we will look to have around these bins, as you described them, Ellie, that don't have a rule-making framework. But I wanted to suggest that I could either do one of two things today. I could either be sort of a talking points around why regulations are needed and the role of government, and I could certainly say a reasonable amount about that. But there's a very special reason you were gathered today, in that there's a second path to problem solving. And I refer to this as the path of government with a lowercase g. And the lowercase g, government, has a lot more to do with multi-stakeholder collaboration and consensus that requires a little bit more conducting of an orchestra than a dictate from a very clear sheet of paper that says these are the rules and you're in, you're out. It's messy, but it's probably our most likely path forward. And it requires a room with engineers and policymakers coming together. When President Obama created the role of CTO, I reported directly to the president, which was sort of a weird thing because it was sort of an odd role to have in a position of that sort. So, here you are in the senior staff meeting, it's the Roosevelt room every morning, and it's, where's the economy? And it's Larry Summers talking about how difficult things are, and Orzag's describing how difficult the budget is given all the spending, and Dennis McDonough on foreign wars, and it's, okay, tech guy, we released the new open data set today. It's sort of a mismatch of policy objectives. But I say that half-heartedly because what happened during that experience is that engineering was a constraint, not an enabler. Policymakers would take the given and try to jam rulemaking on top of what they believed was the best we could do technically. Need data sharing between the vaccination data in the states and the feds? Well, it's in a SQL database that has names and this one doesn't. So let's create like a 7,000-page Word document, legal framework that outlines thou shalt not do this, but can do that, but not do this. And we'll put legalese at the foundation of this rickety engineering method of data sharing. Or technology could be the enabler to say, what actually are you trying to accomplish? And how might we, in more modern methods of engineering, allow for the cake and eat it too approach? Those early days in the Obama administration, I loved the cake and eat it too approach. I remember we had a hearing where the discussion was a physician, a community doctor, who was lamenting the state of interoperability. Fine, everybody laments the state of interoperability, but he shared a very interesting anecdote. He said, I had a patient that was moving to Arizona from Virginia, and it turned out that the doctor she was transferring to was on the same IT system that I have. And so she'd asked, rather than printing out and physically carrying the medical record, could he somehow transmit the information electronically? So he didn't know any better. He went into the IT system and file export, success. The patient's record came out, sent it over email to the doctor in Arizona who downloaded the file and file import, and magically it worked. While the doctor is testifying, the room is full of lawyers, because that's typically who shows up at these things, and they are like, what? You can't use email? That's a sensitive health record. And he looked around at them and says, yeah, the patient wanted me to do it, but how long do I have to wait for you people to give up a regulatory framework that is, so we could have said, you know what, here's a new rule, you can or you can't, you got to fill out the form in triplicate. This is the lawyer answer. What did we do? We said, let's spin up an engineering sprint, lock them up in 6 months, actually took them 90 days. Come up with a technical architecture for safe, secure email. Turns out SMTP, the protocol, could be relatively easily attached to a stronger method of identity, and you could have an internet within the internet. Who knew? Who knew? At like no cost, we were able to identify a method that within 6 months of that date, we were able to sneak into the rule that said, oh, by the way, in addition to these complicated interoperability methods where lawyers write hundreds of pages, you could safely and securely email. You got to authenticate the sender, authenticate the receiver, and use what's essentially kind of a server that manages that, and you've got internet within the internet. That became regulated, and now every doctor in the country has it. Now, here's the shady thing. The email industry, I should say the healthcare IT email industry, formed a coalition, and they voted to keep everyone's email addresses secret. So yes, technically there's secure email, but Dr. Peel, I don't know how anyone at UPMC is going to know how to call someone from Allegheny and email the record when you can't look it up no yellow pages. So there needs rules around that. So multi-stakeholder efforts work to some degree, but not always. I want to suggest to you that there's an opportunity that we're witnessing in this sort of big data revolution that allows us to find a cake and eat it too solution to some of the big areas of anxiety that we've just alluded to. I'm in the middle of one, so I'll share the area that I'm spending my time on these days. I co-chair something called the Karen Alliance. It was created by two Republican electronic health record leaders, the Office of the National Coordinator, David Brailer, and Secretary Levitt, who of course was HHS Secretary, and then two sort of Democrats, if you will, myself and David Blumenthal, who served in the Obama administration. And we kind of put a group together and said exactly where Ellie was. We have HIPAA that is considered a constraint for data sharing. We have at the heart of HIPAA a right for every American to access their own medical records. By the way, if you read the statute, you actually have these two fundamental rights: constraint, abundance. Now here's what's funny. If you walk into a hospital and say, I'd like my medical record, are they giving you the constraint form or the abundance form? Everybody gets a HIPAA authorization form. You allow the hospital to share your records and then to make them available to folks who need it under these very specific rules. Ask a hospital, can I have my right of access data? The form doesn't exist, or at least it didn't until we started, literally. So you have a law with no engineering approach and no demand signal to implement. Well, fast forward, this idea of what is consumer data, what is health data, it creates two technical opportunities. Technical opportunity number one was the power of APIs. I believe deeply that APIs are the foundation of a cake and eat it too engineering path, because you can embed policy at the authorization token layer. So you can have the same data set, multiple API tokens that reflect individual use cases instead of the one legal framework to rule them all. I don't mean to dismiss the lawyers, but generally the one legal framework to rule them all leaves nobody happy. So we came up with a framework that said the consumer should have application access to their data. And thankfully, Apple stepped up and said, we're going to be the alpha testers of this. And they worked with all of the electronic health record vendors to say, what does it mean for Dr. Pamela Peel to exercise her rights and access her health information using an app on her phone? And how does the process work where she can authenticate herself and then extract that information away from a HIPAA-covered entity to a consumer-controlled entity? So check. We had the API framework tested, validated, and now, by the way, it's universal. The second step of the equation we still grapple with, and that is, what are the constraints on Apple post-transfer of the data? In my view, government with a lowercase g would set rules without the lawyers in Washington forcing kind of micro solutions. And we reached a framework that said, you're going to voluntarily attest that you're going to handle data in a HIPAA-like manner, you're going to protect it, you're going to secure it, and you're going to be held accountable for promising your patients, your customers, that you're doing this. And if you don't, you'd be in violation directly. Not in the gray area like GoodRx, but in the direct line because you said you're doing something and you didn't. Thankfully, at this point, the majority of consumer-designated apps have voluntarily adopted this issue. But there's a third leg to this stool where the engineering and the policy meet. Many of these organizations have business models, and the people who pay for these services have a unique role in demanding the adoption and use of the engineering nimble solution outside of whether or not a regulation requires it. If UPMC decides to communicate or work with a company that both holds data that's generated by UPMC, but also can bring information in the consumer world, one could voluntarily say by contract, we want you to treat that consumer data akin to HIPAA data, and you will not get a contract with us if we don't. Symposiums like this could result in model contracts that would allow vendors selling to third parties, this world of B2C to B, to kind of move and drive a strategy. But I'll leave you with this very pragmatic call to action, because it comes down to who's in the room and who's in a position to compel the stakeholders to reach consensus. We currently don't have a CTO in the Biden administration. I do lament that. I do wish that we had someone, because the role I played in many ways was the nudger, the annoyer, the convening people and directing and asking, even if they weren't required to, because sometimes you need that catalyst to bring folks around the table to work on efforts. But absent that, we kind of have to maybe step up and do some of that amongst ourselves. If Apple didn't voluntarily say we want to work in a standards-based way on the new engineering to do the right thing, that was the actions of one firm, frankly, of one man, Dr. Bud Tribble, who was ironically a doctor and their chief security officer. How about that? We need more Bud Tribbles. So for those of you in industry who think about, well, I'm not legally required to report X, so I'm not going to report X, but I feel a little bit skeevy about it, let's come to the table and work together, because the policymakers absolutely need the education. They're eager to issue calls to action, and they will test, validate, and scale the engineering solutions that work. But you gotta raise your hand. It doesn't happen unless those with engineering backgrounds raise their hands. I'll give you one final story, then I'll let you get to the day. I remember vividly, one of the first things I used to do when I was in the role, I didn't know any better. What do you know, right? I was fresh in the role. So I said, you know what, it was the middle of the economic recession. I'm gonna call a bunch of tech CEOs and just understand what's happening in your world. And so I was going down my list, and I was on the phone with the CEO of Verizon, Ivan Seidenberg. And it was a speakerphone. There was no Zoom at that time, we have a phone call. And we're having this polite conversation, introducing myself, everything's going well. And I asked him the question. I said, out of curiosity, you've got, at this point, telecommunications are fairly, commodity. Everyone's got access to it. What sector of the U.S. economy seems to be underinvested in tech so that it's an area of growth for you? Where's your growth? If you're going to grow, where are you going to grow? He pauses for a minute and he goes, by the way, you're speaking to me on a room with 100 lawyers sitting next to me to make sure I don't say anything wrong. It was some number like that. But he said, in all seriousness, I'd never really been asked this question because that's kind of a weird thing that the government's asking me how I can help grow. Okay, I don't think that's weird. I mean, we need the economy to grow, so tell me. The answer was healthcare. And that was interesting, by the way, sort of not related to the topic, but just the idea that fit the agenda. But the more important point was he then assigned his CTO, Shaigan Karigpour, if I'm not mistaken. And it's funny, the lawyers and lobbyists have a very formal process of who gets to come to Washington, what they can say, how they can interact or whatever. But I started cold calling the CTOs. They don't talk to the government affairs people. That was awesome. Awesome. Because they would tell me, oh, this is the engineering approach. If that's your problem, why don't you try this and draw this on a napkin? And how would you try that? And that's a good idea. And then I would go to the other room and I would hear what their government affairs people would say about what the policy should be. And they would say the exact opposite. That was kind of a fun game for me. I'd kept that to myself many times. But the premise was the CTOs are the activator arm for the lowercase g government engineering policy framework for privacy. And to me, that's the group we need to cultivate. So I hope this is going to be a constructive dialogue. I'm eager to see what you all do, and I'm hopeful people will call this kind of group to action so we can make progress, not just in years, waiting for Congress to bequeath the next Moses tablets, but to actually get something done while we wait for that nirvana. Good luck.
Okay, so thank you, Aneesh. And we will get our first round of panelists up. So this will be moderated by Michelle de Mooy. And if our panelists, sorry, I should have done this a moment before. If you head to the back real quickly and get mic'd up. If everybody wants to grab a cup of coffee, by all means. And then, let's see. I believe we have Rachele, I don't believe has made it yet. the traffic really has been that bad. So hopefully, Rob, if you might be willing to take one of our panelist roles for this morning, that would be terrific. And we'll go from there. So we'll give everybody a moment to grab some coffee, and then we'll get rolling with the next panel.
So good morning. Thanks for your attention, and sorry for the quick delay there, but it gave you a chance to get muffins and coffee and everything. So as Ellie said, we'll be talking about the policy portion of this equation of policy and engineering. And with me, I have some brilliant minds with a lot of different perspectives, and they'll introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I want to say thank you so much for coming. It's great to see friends, old and new, and I'm really excited to facilitate this conversation. I have a background in policy, but at Georgetown, I direct the Tech and Public Policy program in the McCourt School of Public Policy. So I'm sort of developing programs, but not doing straight up policy anymore. So it's fun for me to talk about and to facilitate conversations about it. So first, I'll start off with Andrew. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and also what would you say is the biggest privacy or policy issue that you've been facing in your own work recently?
Sure.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so Andrew Reiskind, my formal title is Senior Vice President of Data Strategy at Mastercard. So what does that actually mean? That means my team is a global team that works with the product development teams across Mastercard. And what we do is we enable the use of data for innovation. But as we do so, we make sure we are innovating safely and responsibly and mitigating any potential data risks. My own background is, yes, I am a lawyer. I will acknowledge that. I did start out as a patent lawyer and then switched to privacy over the years. But for the past 6 years, I actually was tapped by the head of data analytics and switched into business roles. And so this role actually doesn't report through legal. This is actually a business role. So it actually comes with a lot more, I would say, varied responsibility in a lot of ways than just a pure legal responsibility. Relative to a data privacy symposium and the biggest issue that I'm personally working on, first, I just want to reframe from privacy, because I think the data landscape has shifted a lot over the last couple of years, and we really view privacy as a baseline conversation, but it's not the totality of the conversation. So when I was talking to Ellie about this, I said, to me, this should be a data policy symposium, because the issues go way beyond privacy. And at Mastercard, we had acknowledged that about 2 years ago, we launched some data responsibility principles that said privacy and security are baseline. Everything has to start from there, but you have to build from there. So we have additional principles like inclusion, societal benefit, and integrity. And so it's not just about privacy anymore. And a lot of the policy issues regarding data are not about privacy as well. For example, many of us are facing data localization issues, and those don't necessarily come from a place of privacy. Those really come from national security and other regime issues that local governments are facing that they don't want the data offshore. So personally, the issues that I've been most focused on are open banking and AI governance. So let me explain what open banking is, so not everybody's familiar with it. If you go and use tax preparation software and you want to do your buying and selling of your stock assets to do your Schedule D, in the old days, and I will say I'm old, is we used to have to fill out on paper and go through every single stock sale and write it down. Nowadays, you use your tax prep software, you give it the username and password for your financial accounts, and it just pulls it through automatically. And so what used to take several hours now takes milliseconds. You can now have the same experience when applying for a mortgage. For those of us who've applied for a mortgage, it used to be a stack of papers like this you'd have to fill out, copies of bank statements, all this stuff. Nowadays, you can apply for a mortgage by just going through the application process and pull the data directly from your financial systems. And that way, the underwriter actually has verification as the source of the information. So it's much more reliable to the underwriter, but all the information is now available to them. And so the issues with open banking, from a data perspective, are very different than a lot of the basic privacy ones, because this is all permissioned. When I'm doing my tax preparation, I'm giving permission to the software to pull the data. It is for my benefit. So the privacy issue is front and center, addressed through a consent mechanism. The issues, though, are the technicals here. Like, how often does the bank need to make the data available? What is the format of the data? Does the format have to match the software's data? What's the API structure? So we heard discussion about APIs. How do we capture the consent technically? So there's a whole set of standards, FAPI is the acronym, relative to how do I capture the consent. Security, how do I get to security of an API? How do I get to security of those banking credentials? Those are very near and dear to me. I do not want those lost in an ecosystem because then somebody could basically write checks from my bank account. And so those are the kinds of technical issues that we're facing in open banking. The other issue that I'm working on is AI governance. And so I think all of us have been reading the papers, and Ellie referenced the word already of ChatGPT. And so this is a brave new world for many of us. We had stood up a program about 2 years ago, but I would say every day it is evolving and changing. Generative AI is introducing new questions about how to address it. I mean, all of this is based upon the ideas of transparency and preventing harms. So there's a baseline understanding of this, but there aren't a baseline understanding of actually how do you implement from the first principles. And so we know the EU is regulating, New York City has regulated, we're expecting more states to do regulation, but there is going to be a lot of questions and a lot of work to be done between policymakers and the engineers of what do those principles actually mean in practice. So those are the conversations that we're having and that we're thinking through.
Great, thank you. Naomi.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So I'm Naomi Lefkovitz, and my formal title is Senior Privacy Policy Advisor at NIST in the Information Technology Lab. I also am a lawyer by background, but I also lead our privacy engineering program. And maybe rather than explaining like exactly what we do in the privacy engineering program, I'll start by explaining why we thought we needed one, and that will actually, I think, tell you what we do. So about 10 years ago, you may be familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, and that was being developed under direction by an executive order in the Obama administration. And we had to develop a methodology to protect privacy and civil liberties as part of that framework development. And we thought, well, we'll just run that alongside the cybersecurity framework development, and no problem. Long story short, while the cybersecurity people were in the room, it was done as a public collaboration with stakeholders across all sectors. And while they were in the room and they were debating things like this standard versus that standard, first we couldn't even get the privacy people in the room, and the security people were just like, well, we protect the data, so aren't we done with privacy? And meanwhile in the background, subways are getting shut down in like San Francisco, like the internet, and remember all those incidents. And so we're like, well, sometimes good cybersecurity measures also have an impact on privacy. So they were like, huh. So we finally got the privacy people in the room, the lawyers, the policy people. They all started debating, but what they were debating was the meaning of privacy, and we don't all use the fair information practice principles, and so on and so forth. And for being NIST and being sort of a sort of a blend between a government agency and a research institution, we're very curious as to like, why did cybersecurity, both disciplines, started about 40 years ago, and we're in the 70s. Gosh, is that 50 already? Yikes! I don't know where the last 10 years went. Anyway, and so we were like, why did cybersecurity get to the place where they could debate standards and they have this huge body of work on guidance and all this technical controls and here's privacy still debating the meaning of privacy. So so that was a catalyst for the development of this privacy engineering program. And we sort of modeled it, and we looked at cybersecurity, and we saw that, they took this risk-based approach, and they had these sort of foundational constructs around a risk model that if you ask anyone in security, like, what is the risk model, they will invariably say, what's the likelihood that a threat will be a vulnerability will be exploited by a threat, and what's the impact if that occurs, or some very close variation. Ask privacy, like, what is the risk model for privacy? You get varied answers. So they had a widespread risk model that they all agreed upon, and they had a set of security objectives, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which really helped, going to Aneesh's point is, it really helped the engineering folks say, like, what are our objectives? Like, they have principles too, but they don't start with their principles, right? You don't sort of look around your system and say, like, where should I apply least access, right? First you say, like, how much confidentiality do I need in this system? Like, how valuable are the assets? Then you think about whether this principle would be helpful in selecting your controls. And so we looked at that and we said, can we do the same thing for privacy? And what we focused on was looking at privacy not only as, certainly an aspect of protecting the data that accrues to the benefit of privacy, but also thinking about it from this perspective of, data processing. Organizations need to process data. By processing, we mean everything in the information lifecycle, collection through disposal. And they need to do that for mission and business purposes in the government, in the private sector, in academia. And that can have implications, or sort of as a byproduct, can have these adverse effects on people. And so we were able then to sort of capture those, and they, to your point about, is it privacy or is it ethics, or these problems can range from just simply embarrassment over having information revealed that you didn't think was going to happen, or insights were learned about you, or discrimination, all the way up to physical harm or economic loss. So we can name that range of problems, and if we can do that, then we can say, so which sort of data action, which operation with data, would sort of move from sort of benign to creating some of these problems, or in any given context. And once we could sort of define that and state that, we had a risk model. And we were able to develop a tool for assessing risk, our privacy risk assessment methodology, and eventually we were asked to develop a privacy framework and lead a process to develop a privacy framework modeled after the cybersecurity framework. So it was a little bit of a long way of telling you that our privacy engineering program, our goal was to help build some foundational constructs for this field, and then move that into tools and guidance and frameworks. And now, with that in place, we can now move on to the. I'll move on to the second part of your question, which is what's the policy issue that we're grappling with, or the privacy issue. And that goes back to what Ellie was talking about this morning as well, which is, we have policy drivers in the government, thanks in good part to Aneesh, to open data sets, make them more available, and privacy and security are seen as sort of barriers to that, in part because of the laws that you've heard about, and also aversion to risk, right? Nobody in government ever wants to end up on the front page of the Washington Post or hauled into a hearing, right? So, but we also have, finally AI is becoming, getting to a point where it's really viable and going to provide valuable insights to solve, significant problems. And so, so what we are really grappling with is, how do we make better, provide or enable better access to data while still protecting privacy and security. And so right now we are co-sponsoring a Privacy Enhancing Technologies Prize Challenge with NSF and supported by the Office of Science and Technology Policy and also with colleagues in the UK on privacy preserving federated learning. So that, rather than, as Aneesh was talking about, rather than even having to share the data or move the data can stay where it lives. And you can train models on that, and then the local models, and then have those updates to an aggregator where you can create a global model that everyone can use. And so in our prize challenge, we are focusing on the use case. We have synthetic data sets for financial crime and for pandemic, for forecasting infections. And so getting exactly to that point of, without this, we wouldn't be able, you couldn't normally share that information. There's location data in there, there's infection rates, there's all kinds of sensitive data. And it's really exciting time, I think. But, some of the challenges continue to be, can we even use these technologies? Will they be legal? Will they meet these legal requirements? And that is just it's very, I understand it, but it's, these laws were developed in a time that didn't, as Aneesh was saying, didn't really contemplate the outcomes. Let's focus on outcomes rather than saying what what in this parlance is a control, right? These laws say, you can get consent or you can't disclose this, rather than saying sort of what was the outcome that we wanted, so that then engineers can figure out, and policymakers together, and lawyers can figure out what's the best way to get there, because that's always going to be changing, and that's why these laws are falling behind.
Okay, great,
Start
thank
there.
you.
Sorry.
No, it's really interesting. I appreciate that. Okay, Rachele.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Rachele Hendricks-Sturrup. I'm the Research Director of Real World Evidence at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. Not too far from Georgetown University. We're located in Washington, D.C., but we also have an office at our Duke University campus in Durham. I have staff in both locations, so it's nice to be able to traverse. But together, my team and I do a wide range of things. First, we host our Real World Evidence Collaborative, which is a group of experts from industry, academia, areas of civil society, including patient advocacy. We bring them all together to discuss and contemplate and address a range of issues that accompany real-world data and evidence implementation across regulatory and payment settings. And also, separately from managing and hosting our collaborative, my personal research portfolio with my team is exploring ethical, legal, and social implications to real-world evidence implementation in those settings and across a range of other settings as well, including research settings, depending on the type of data that we're considering. So obviously within all of that, privacy comes up quite a bit. Last year in May, we hosted an event on the state of real-world evidence policy. And one of the major takeaways and themes that came out of that event was trust and transparency across the real-world data lifecycle. So thinking all the way from data sourcing to data curation to data dissemination and implementation. What does trust and transparency across that entire life cycle look like? And what is our job to ensure that that happens? And how can we take best practices from the field, make them better if we can, by assessing all of the entire range of tools at our disposal, including privacy-enhancing technologies that my colleague Naomi just mentioned. How do we consider all of that within this landscape in order to make policy recommendations to address essentially legal gaps in protections for privacy and security? Over the past 2 days, actually just this week, we hosted a private convening with members of our collaborative and outside of our collaborative with the FDA observing this meeting. This meeting was actually convened by the FDA because they are trying to grapple with this very issue of privacy and security and data, mainly because, for one, real-world evidence that in itself means it means a data, or at least it implicates data from a wide range of sources. So we're thinking about electronic health record data, claims data, health registry data, registries owned by disease advocacy organizations like rare disease organizations, where they oftentimes have to band together in order to increase their statistical N, just to make it relevant and attractive to medical product developers to help them. Thinking about all of that data, but then also within that, genomic data, whether it's from a clinical laboratory or a direct-to-consumer laboratory that a patient could just access on their own and bring into the clinic or bring into a healthcare setting to talk about with their doctors. Thinking about also wearables data. A lot of pharmaceutical companies are really interested in wearables data because it helps facilitate their decentralized clinical trials. So essentially, clinical trials conducted at the point of where the patient is at versus the patient coming to the clinical trial site. We saw a lot of growth in that department during the pandemic. So we're trying to understand, thinking about this wide range of data, also prescription claims data, prescription data, all of this growing range of data sources has lended us to have an oversupply of data, but an undersupply of actual evidence, meaningful evidence that can inform regulatory decision-making about medical products, their safety and efficacy in the real world after they've been approved post-clinical trial, post-phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trial phases. So thinking about phase 4, when it's already in the market, when we don't really understand all of the efficacy and safety implications for the general population versus just for that clinical trial cohort, how can we collect all of this evidence to make sense of it, to make sure that the right populations and subpopulations have access to that medical product? For example, typically when a drug is approved by the FDA and it enters the market, it doesn't always mean that it's covered by insurers. So meaningful access is an issue, and evidence is hopefully here to drive that coverage decision that would allow the highest risk and most vulnerable patients and subpopulations of patients to access that medical product. How can real-world evidence feed into that, or at least support that endeavor? Also, how can it inform post-market surveillance efforts by the FDA to ensure that it's not only effective but also safe in certain categories or of people or subpopulations that might have adverse reactions to that medication, especially patients who take more than one medication and therefore are at higher risk for drug-drug interactions, and therefore adverse outcomes as a result. So we think about all of this, and obviously privacy and security come up again a lot because of the wide range of data sources that are implicated. And also because oftentimes within the scope of privacy and security, there's the question of, okay, well, when we think about privacy, we're thinking more about data discretion and informed consent, whether it's opt-in or opt-out or broad consent to primary and secondary uses of data. Data security is more about the data's already been collected, it's housed and stored somewhere. How do we make sure that it's kept confidential and safe from attack, essentially? So we have to think about that. We have to think about privacy and security that way. And then also we have to think about in what settings, or at least within the range of settings in which data is collected, how is informed consent applied differently? So obviously, if someone is wearing a wearable device, a consumer device, or if they have other types of consumer-generated data like geolocation data, that could be implicated in their health information for a range of purposes. How does that consent model differ from the consent model that we typically see in HIPAA-covered settings like healthcare, where data is collected for the purposes, or at least for the provision of healthcare services? So again, how do we think about consent based on the data source? And also, how do we think about consent based on the intent to use the data? Who is going to use the data and why, and for what purpose? And what are the power asymmetries at play here between the patient and the data holder or the data collector? So thinking about researchers who are collecting data just for purposes of building generalizable knowledge or assessing the safety and efficacy or comparative effectiveness of a drug. What is the purpose for the data collection, and what is the patient going to get out of that? Are they not going to have their results of whatever test results they provide? Is that going to be returned to them? Is it going to be actionable? If not, then what is the patient left with? So again, all of that feeds into the notion of trust and transparency that I initially talked about. That particular theme that came up last year during our, as I mentioned, our May convening at the Duke Margolis Center on the state of real-world evidence policy. Essentially, these are the conversations that we're having and that we need to have, and that FDA is concerned about, that payers are concerned about. I've recently worked with the American Academy of Actuaries. They're concerned about it as well because what some of my colleagues mentioned, there are lots of algorithms that are used in healthcare settings to make coverage decisions, but where's that data coming from? How reliable is it? Is it fit for purpose for what we're trying to accomplish? What are the data quality standards used in order to determine whether or not the data is true and reliable? There are a lot of questions that come to play, and really, if we make decisions based on flawed data or skewed data, then we're going to make skewed or flawed recommendations for society at large. And so how do we mitigate that? What are best practices? What can we build in order to ensure that populations are not harmed? Individuals and populations are not harmed in the process of us trying to do the work. And then as we think about privacy, this came up yesterday, and it's come up quite a bit in my privacy research career. But when we think about privacy, there's individual privacy, but then there's also collective privacy for a community, communities that want to represent themselves. So thinking about indigenous populations, for example, where they want to hold the discretion as a group, as a collective, about how their data is used. But then also within that, there's what the individual wants. What is my individual right to privacy versus my community's right to privacy? So how might that differ? How is it the same? How do we grapple with that? And so, again, not to boil the ocean, but really it is boiling the ocean here. And oftentimes the answer is it depends. But we're trying to move beyond that to say it depends on what, and what can we do about it? What tools can we empower people with or individuals with in order to ensure that they have trust in the clinical trial landscape, that they have trust in participating in health research despite their privacy-related experiences? What can we do in order to maintain that trust, to make sure that the patients are getting the right medications and treatments at the right time, absent any concerns about privacy and security? So I'll stop there. I think that answers your question.
Okay. That you all had some really thought-provoking answers, so thank you for that. And I guess I'll just briefly say some of the themes that I thought I heard overlap. And one of them was that there are quite a few gaps in terms of, I'll just use the word privacy, frameworks in policy, definitely. For policy frameworks that can be applied in a real-world way. So as far as responsible AI innovation, and it seemed like that was definitely true in healthcare and banking to solve problems like climate change, right? Or targeted medicines. Another was that considering not just individual impacts, but community impacts and population impacts when looking at how data can be matched and used. That was something that I think I heard actually in different ways from each of you. That there are a lot of privacy-enhancing technologies out there that are sort of exist but haven't been harnessed, right? Enough to figure out how to maximize the good and minimize the harm, and that there isn't policy being leveraged to help do that, right? To figure out how to apply them, and also. It's time to shift our way of thinking about data as less a business commodity or as just a business commodity and more as an enabler of practical services and social good. I hope that this is all, you would all agree with this, but I think those are some of the themes as far as new ways to think about policy as less a layering thing and more an enabler. And so I want to kind of get into that a little bit, and I want to maybe start with you, Andrew, since you're right here.
That's fine.
And I do feel like this is a support group for lawyers. You don't have to apologize. It's okay. It's all right. So with open banking, I'm interested in your thoughts, because I know some of the way that unfolded in Europe was sort of seen as kind of a disaster in a way, or at least say problematic. Let's say problematic. What do you think? How do you think it has rolled out here in the U.S.? What do you think the interplay between engineering and policy has been? Has it been the right mix? And finally, do you think the policy and engineering components have served individuals, have served the public or consumers?
Yes. Okay. So just to give a little context for Michelle's comment about disasters. So in Europe, they had launched a directive called PSD2, a Payment Services Directive, that required the banks in Europe to open up their data so that individuals can control their own data, right? Very much European thinking and guidance about individuals own their data, so they should control how it goes. However, there were not economic incentives to the banks to open up those APIs. And so it was a very slow and mixed rollout by the banks because there wasn't an incentive for them to do it. And until regulators or others would start pressuring them, they weren't rushing to do it. I will say that. In the US, right now the CFPB is looking at regulating the space. They were mandated to, I forget the regulation that mandated them to, but they just put out some thoughts and everybody responded, I guess, a week or two ago. But where we've been in the United States is very much starting at a place of what we call screen scraping, where to get access to your banking data, I would actually go into, let's just say, the bank's portal that you otherwise would use and go screen scrape it and put the username and password into it. The banks hated it, rightfully so, because it's an insecure thing to do, and it would also impose things on their front end. And so as a result of that, it created a dialogue with the banks that I think has been a very productive dialogue, which is, how do we make this secure for the consumer? Because we're not saying you can't have the data, we get it, the consumer should have access to their data, but everybody, from an ecosystem perspective, let's do it in a safe and secure way. So I think the industry started solving its own problems, and I think therefore the CFPB, which has had this mandate, has been slow to act, waiting for industry to do what it has been doing, which is taking the measures, setting up industry standards, and getting there to protect the consumer and to provide the services to the consumer. So I think consumers have benefited from it. I think there are a lot of people out here using Venmo. I think a lot of people use tax preparation software. If people use Quicken Loans, right, just as an example, people are leveraging the tools and they're getting the availability of those tools. So I think the consumer benefit is happening. I think industry is making it available and safe for individuals. And so that's where I think in the US, we're in a very different perspective than where we are in Europe because of the industry-led approach that the regulators don't feel like they need to step in, as opposed to in Europe where the regulators felt that they had to step in a little more.
So it's almost a combination of market forces and the nudge by policymakers.
Yes.
And so that maybe that's part of the mix.
It is, and I also think the dialogue that winds up happening over the course of these implementations is very useful because I don't think the regulators understood in Europe the need for an economic incentive. Mm-hmm. But now, based upon the comments from the regulators, they get it. Mm-hmm. That there need to be some economic incentives. I think the US, because they saw what happened in Europe, the industry learned. And could shift. And I think the regulators also understand that and have learned.
So a disaster helps too, kind of.
Well,
or not just.
Never let a crisis go to waste, right? I think it's the mantra.
Europe is kind of helpful in that way.
Yeah,
in
sometimes,
some
yes.
ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Rachele, I'm curious your thoughts on the Precision Medicine Initiative, which you probably may have heard of, and I'm sure Rachele would explain it a little better than I, but what are your thoughts on how the policy and engineering components of that initiative occurred? Do you think that was successful? Do you think the different components worked together in a successful way, and the API component of the PMI, do you think that was helpful or harmful to it?
Well, that's a really good question. I think we're still figuring that out. And one of the reason I say that is because I'm conducting research and engagement with at Duke Margolis with the All of Us Research Program, which is...
Could you explain to the audience what it is?
Absolutely. So the All of Us Research Program is a precision, or it was born out of the 21st Century Cures Act Precision Medicine Initiative, essentially to recruit individuals, a diverse, extremely diverse range, intentionally diverse range of individuals across the United States, encouraging them to participate in the All of Us Research Program registry, allowing the registry access to their electronic medical records, their genomic data, their wearables data, any digital health data that they'd be willing to share. The initiative is very intentional about, as I mentioned, making sure that diversity is front and center. So thinking about diversity from a race, ethnicity, ancestry, gender, geographic location standpoint, you name it. And so far, the initiative has been successful. However, as they enter into year 5 of this initiative, they're trying to maintain that success. And then also they recently rolled out their return of results initiative, or I would say a milestone for the program, where they are returning genomic test results to participants that were willing to enroll in the program. So they're returning genomic results that may be clinically actionable, the reports might include what's called variants of unknown significance, where we don't know yet what this genetic test result means, but it could be implicated in your healthcare, but it might not be. It's still up in the air. At least the science is not very clear or well elucidated. And so as they're doing that, they're thinking about what does that mean for the diverse population, or for the diverse populations that they're trying to engage. And then also, again, going back to privacy and security engineering, I think one of the major issues that have come up within this program is privacy in the form of data discretion and data use. So essentially, as scientists have access to the All of Us Research Program Workbench, which is an online tool, cloud-based platform that allows researchers access to the data, access to identifiable information about the participants in order to conduct research, whether it's research, just for generalizable knowledge, or research for other purposes that might be in the interest of the populations that they're assessing. My research is focused on the African American populations, or African identifying populations within the program. And so every population that is participating in the program has a very different idea about privacy, and they also have very different ideas about what their genomic test results might mean as well, and whether or not they want it to be shared with anyone, and whether or not they want the program to even share it with themselves. So I say that because I don't know if anyone here might have heard, but there were some concerns among the indigenous population here about how their data was being used in the program. It was quite a big deal. A scientist published a work that the community did not agree to and was offended essentially by. And so I say that to remind us about the data discretion part of all of this, data discretion being a form of data privacy, and then also trust and transparency across that data lifecycle. As you curate and disseminate the data, what message are you getting across? Is it the right message for our community, and is it the right message for people outside of our community? So that, and then also within the African American population, we're seeing that there are concerns about the data even being returned to the participants Because, say, for example, a participant learns about their genetic risk for a certain disease. They're concerned about their insurers having access to that data. They're concerned about being able to participate in healthcare as a result. They're concerned about whether or not their insurers would even allow them to qualify for follow-up care based on that result. Oftentimes, the follow-up care is denied. And so therefore, it creates more strain, more financial strain, more psychological and emotional strain for them. And then also sometimes the intersection of data discretion interacts with health belief. So sometimes, for example, participants will say, well, I don't want to know about my test result because then I might just start thinking myself sick. You know, once I learn about my health risk, I might start subconsciously engaging in behavior that might make me succumb to this illness that you've told me I'm at risk for genetically. So I say all this to say that, you know, to your question, has it been successful? I think, again, the answer is always it depends. It depends on the person, the population, how they want their data to be used by themselves and by others in society, by healthcare. We still have a lot of questions that we need to address and a lot of challenges to sort of disentangle on a case-by-case basis. And in addition to that, we have a lot of training to do among even researchers to get them to understand what data privacy and discretion really means. And as we think about privacy engineering and the role that privacy-enhancing technologies play in all of this, I think that's still very nascent. Thinking about, for example, synthetic data as one of many privacy-enhancing technologies. How do we consent participants in precision medicine to the transformation of their data into synthetic data? How do they even know what that means? So there are some consent models that we need to develop even around that. Yeah. And we need to make sure that even not just the public, but even key stakeholders like, for example, the FDA, like what are their thoughts about synthetic data and how acceptable that could be in applications that they receive? How are they sure that it's not that the synthetic data they're receiving, or even differential privacy, for example, where noise is introduced into a data set, how are they sure that that is actually reliable when it hits their desk, as they have to make very important decisions about drug efficacy and safety for the population at large? So we're already or at least probably from a regulatory standpoint, they're already at risk of approving a drug that's not safe and effective for the general population based on clinical trial data. So if you make that process even more complicated or unclear, then how confident will they be about all of these technologies and techniques? So again, when we think about privacy engineering, yes, the science is great, the concepts are great, but the real world practice is a little different. Mm-hmm. And that's what the precision, I would say, to your question about whether or not it's been successful or where are we at with precision medicine, mm-hmm. I would say that's where we're at, where I think the more we develop and the more we build and learn and know, the more questions we have about what to do with all of that and within the scope and practice of precision medicine. Mm-hmm. So we're not there yet, but we're getting there.
No, I think that's a great answer, and it certainly seems clear that it's outstripped policy's ability to keep up with it. And so I guess that leads me to you, Naomi. When you mentioned the work I think that you said you were doing or looking towards around privacy-federated learning, because that really, I think, is interesting. My instinct is to go towards a public model of that, but obviously that's maybe a ways off, because I think it would be great for the public to be able to access that at some point down the road to do their own AI experiments, right? But I'm curious how you deal with, when you talked about policy sort of not really knowing how to layer and seeing it as almost a barrier to doing that. But I'm curious as to what policy would even apply to that data, because how do you know what that data is, right? Because most policy is about the data, what data type it is. So I'm curious how that mix of data would even be, you would have characteristics, right? How you would even qualify what that type of data is, because that is a huge problem, right? That I think Ellie brought up, just that data gets so mixed up, and it is so difficult now to break apart into these categories. That's one of the reasons policy is so outdated. That I'm curious how you have or how you will deal with that problem in engineering.
So that, I would say, goes back to why I wanted to talk about, introducing this concept of, privacy being more risk-based and following a more risk-based approach. Because, what we did with the NIST privacy framework, which was, a little surprising to people, was that we just refused to use any term like personal data or personally identifiable information. And we just said, this is about data and data processing, because our model doesn't care what your definition is. It simply cares, like, what are you doing with data, and what's the likelihood that that could create what we consider a problematic data action, that is some adverse effect on people, on individuals or groups. And once you're in that space, your definition doesn't matter. And so all of these issues of combining data and sort of like, did we combine, is it health data, is it not health data, again, doesn't matter. It simply matters, is there, what's the likelihood that there's going to be some kind of adverse effect?
Well, how would it handle, then, say, Rachele's problem with individuals having different, consent or ideas about different forms of data, and genetic data, which is obviously intrinsically identifiable?
So in that world, so if you ran our methodology and used our tool, you would come out with these sort of contextual factors and these sort of issues of, this proportion of, people that were, processing their data on, or this set of people, feel this way about this data. And so the issue of consent is sort of the last point in the process, because consent is essentially, in this world, a type of control, right? And so rather than starting from that point, the point is, where are the adverse effects? And now, what's the most effective way to mitigate these risks, assuming that you've decided that they're grave enough to mitigate, right? Then what's the best control or set of controls? And consent might be one of them for some groups, and it might not be necessary for others. And so they might be perfectly happy with you saying, we put in this privacy enhancing technology, don't worry about it, but you're happy, and they're happy, right? And that's why also we came up with a set of privacy engineering objectives that are complementary to the security ones of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Ours are predictability, manageability, and disassociability. And so predictability isn't about saying you have to tell everybody every detail. It's more about, do they have a reliable assumptions about what is happening with data? And if that's good, then they're good. And that might just mean, like, we didn't have to tell them everything. We just put in privacy enhancing technologies so that they could have that trust. But others might need more information, right? Mm-hmm. So it really, the point of risk management is to not think about it the way we've thought about it in privacy, which is everybody gets this blanket notice that nobody reads. But hey, I checked the box on compliance. Mm-hmm. It's more of like, is this effective? Like, what privacy benefit are people getting? And then you can tailor your controls appropriately.
Oh, great. So I think our time is up. So I just want to thank all of you. No, there's a great answer, a great discussion. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us. And join me in thanking them, please.
Second seconding the thanks. That was a terrific conversation. So we'll take a short break now, about 5 minutes, and then we'll kick over to a one-on-one fireside chat, and we'll flow straight into the engineering panel from there. If my panelists can all get mic'd up in the back, that would be terrific, and then we'll move a little more quickly through that section. But yeah, please help yourself to coffee and food in the back. Again, I'm Ellie Graeden. I'm a research professor here at Georgetown, and I'm here with Rob Sherman, who's going to introduce himself. But we are going to have a bit of a conversation about how we move from this policy domain into the engineering domain. How does this feed into what the engineering needs to be, and how we engineer those systems to really effectively meet the policy requirements? So Rob, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Sure. Well, I feel like everybody in the previous panel introduced themselves by saying, here's my job title, but here's what I actually do. So maybe I'll pick up on that. So my job title is I'm a vice president for data policy and deputy chief privacy officer at Meta. And so what that actually means, I guess I would describe my role as a translator and as a solution builder, and actually very relevant to the conversation that we're about to have, thinking about how to translate what we discuss in the policy space and what the expectations are of how a company like Meta across our different products and services will handle data, and how to actually operationalize that in a way that works. And so that takes a bunch of different forms, but broadly trying to think about how to build things that are valuable to people, and do that in a way that meets expectations.
Yeah, that's great. So wanted to dive right in. You've been at Meta since 2012, and we've been talking about the exponential growth of data itself, but there's also the exponential speed at which technology is evolving. And we all know policy does not move that quickly. One of the things that came up at dinner last night was that we finally got privacy stated in the State of the Union address, and it's taken 15 years to get that word in. And I think it's this disconnect between the rate of technological change, the speed and the growth of data, versus the policy that tries to keep up. So I'd love to hear, especially sort of given your career arc, where have you seen this work well? What makes it work well when it does work well? Where and how do we have policy that keeps up?
Well, maybe starting with something that you said in your introduction at the beginning of the day, I think one of the challenges is very often the policy and legal space is using different language to address problems than we think about in the product or engineering space. And I think one of the reasons why I'm excited about the conversation today is because it really helps to bridge that. But I think, I and my team, we see that, and folks across the company who are working on privacy really see that in a very tangible way, because I'm a lawyer by training. We use words all the time like reasonableness, and we say, okay, but you should act in a reasonable way in doing such and such thing. And then when you go to an engineer and say, I want you to code this product, this system to act reasonably, just don't have any idea what you're talking about. There's no way to do that. And I think it comes from this fact that there is very rapid technological change. So the way that we would solve that as a lawyer is by having broader standards like reasonableness. And then we can decide later what reasonableness means. From an engineering standpoint, you need to build the system to do a particular thing and then update it regularly over time. And so bridging that becomes really important. The way that I think about this in terms of the work that we do is building expectations about how we handle data, both how we use data to create value for our community, and also how we protect it and use it responsibly, building it into our system, our products and systems in a way that is consistent and robust and doesn't require everybody who builds a product at our company to understand what reasonable means or to understand the specifics of what's expected when it comes to data protection. And so, you mentioned I've been at the company for about a decade now, which is a long time in any years, but I think especially for a tech company where, when I started, and so I think we've been trying to do the same basic thing in all of those contexts, but what it's looked like has evolved a lot because the challenges are just a lot more nuanced and complex. And I think, Naomi, you talked about that in your conversation too. So, when I joined the company, a lot of the challenges were, audience, making sure that people, if you share a photo on Facebook and I'm not your friend and you're only sharing it with friends, everybody in the company doesn't need to know to check audience, but we definitely shouldn't be showing your photo to me if I'm not eligible to see it. Or another one that's more recent is deletion. So, thinking about across complex distributed systems, how do we delete data? So that's sort of where we started. Where we are now is in these, more complex, more nuanced spaces. Like, how do we think about minimizing the data that we collect in places where we don't need it? So one example is building this idea of an anonymous credential service, which is something that we've open sourced and we use on WhatsApp. So when you're typing in the business that you want to contact, you have to run a search, but ideally the server wouldn't know it's Ellie looking for these things. And so, and I think so allowing an authorized person to get access to this, but translating it in a way that makes sense and that doesn't require the creation of additional data is a really important thing. I mean, in your question about sort of where have we seen this work, I think actually something Aneesh said earlier really resonated for me, which is this idea of multi-stakeholderism and thinking about things as an ongoing effort. Because I think if you sort of start from the premise of, Congress or a state legislature or whoever will sort of write a bunch of rules and throw them over the fence, and then somebody on the other side will catch them and implement them. As technology evolves, it just becomes very difficult to do that. And so I think actually it's really critical to bring everybody into one space and talk about this. One place that I think you talked about ChatGPT, and I think I think it's probably clear to everybody in the room that we're going to be spending a lot of time on AI in the coming months and years. One of the things that we've actually been doing that I'm really excited about, and I hope we'll do more of, is this idea of policy prototyping. So we have a program called Open Loop that we've participated in along with governments and small and large businesses from around the world. And the idea is basically, let's take an idea that we think might work, right? So how do you do this kind of AI governance, for example? And let's just try it, right? So we'll try it at our scale, and then small businesses and startups try it at their scale, and we just figure out what our experience is. And then we learn, okay, this was really effective, this didn't work, and we need to do it in a different way. And I think that can't happen once, but if it happens on an ongoing basis, I think it actually gets to much better outcomes, both for people and for the people that regulate and the people that are regulated.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that raises in my mind is this difference between big P policy, sort of policy that's written down by regulators and pushed through Congress, versus small p policy. And what it sounds like to me is that you're describing small p policy in the sort of test bed incubation, what's going to work when you're actually trying to implement a system. But I think there's this question, at least in my head, for how we move from, and really move effectively from small p policy, the sort of how do we implement these things within a company, within a specific institution, and move that into big P policy that then is rational and works, and that you can write down as engineering spec without it just being a check the box function. So that really gets to this sort of duality or sort of multiplex nature of what data are and which buckets they fall into and how we regulate those. When we have these data that cross domains, how do you write good little p policy for that? How does that then marry up to big P policy?
So on the little p side, I mean, I think it's a very prescient question. I mean, I think the mouse and Parkinson's example that you gave earlier is a really good one, because I don't think anybody would argue that a computer shouldn't collect mouse movements. You have to do that in order to use it. But then, trying to infer that somebody has a medical diagnosis or using data in a certain way is I think, can be challenging and is a very different kind of use than probably people expected when they use their mouse. And so the way that I would think about this is really focusing less on the data type, right? Is this a body movement, right? So like a mouse movement is a body movement. You could say that's really sensitive and we should regulate it. Say like it's okay to use your body movement for the purpose of moving the mouse. If you're going to do something that is more sensitive with it, then there are restrictions or there are additional protections that come into place when you do that. And I think that is a really important concept of thinking about, Naomi talked about risk-based frameworks and thinking about things from a risk-based perspective. But I think understanding the context in which data is being used and understanding the value and the positive aspects and also what are the uses that require additional protection. I think that's that's really important. A good example of this in our work is, we recently announced MetaQuest Pro, which has eye tracking capability. And so, this is an area that, again, really important for basic human interaction to work, right? So, if you and I are in a virtual space and I'm looking you in the eye, the system needs to know that so that it can render it. But again, there are lots of ways that could be used in ways that are less expected and potentially more challenging. And so what we did is we actually spent a lot of time with lots of different experts talking about the need for it, how to protect it, what it would look like. And we put out a white paper sort of simultaneously with releasing the product that talked about the choices that we had made. And so I think that, in a way that's very concrete, and some people may agree or disagree with them, but I think being able to, one, have the conversation in real time as we're building, and then also be clear about what we've decided is a really important aspect of that. And I think the feedback has been that we did, a pretty decent job in managing that and in building some really important features to enable people to connect. When you translate that to big P policy, I think it's actually a similar thing, right? So we've all can think of legal regimes that are very prescriptive, right? So, that say, okay, your privacy policy needs to be in this point font and needs to be displayed in this way, and like these kinds of things, which work well at a moment in time. But then when, now my company's thinking about, virtual and augmented reality. And so the idea of like a link to a privacy policy at this size and this place on a website just isn't a concept that really makes sense. And if your goal is actually to empower people and educate them and enable them to make choices, that's probably not the right model to do it. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have, the very notional, like the reasonableness that I talked about before, which says like, act reasonably and then, we'll figure out what happens if you don't later. And I think that is a good way of future-proofing in the sense that it gives a regulator a lot of discretion, but it's not a good way of future-proofing in the sense of giving really concrete guidance about what needs to happen in a particular place. So if neither of those work, what does? In my experience, there's an idea of using principles-based regulation or principles-based policy that sits somewhere in the middle and that says, okay, we're not going to be as general as be reasonable, right? We're going to actually say things in a way that's concrete and actionable and tells you what to do, but we're not going to specify the implementation, right? You have to tell people prominently X, but we're not going to say it has to be in this link, in this font, in this place. And then that allows people to understand how things should work and what the value judgments that the policy is trying to make without getting into a place where it's not future-proofed. And so the one thing that I think is important in doing that is, I say this actually a lot internally to our teams, when we write policy, it needs to be written in a way that you could disagree with it, right? So saying like, do things that are good for data subjects. Like we all agree, but that doesn't actually help make a decision. Saying you should prioritize privacy. I'll use your data sharing example, right? So you could say it's really important for research to be made available for generalizable knowledge. And even if there's some risk that that data might be misused, we think it's important to make the data available. Or you could say the opposite. So you could land in either place, but being clear about that is super important. I think what that allows you to do is to make value judgments that then can be implemented through a multi-stakeholder exercise across different situations. One example of this that I think has been effective, although it's early, is the Age-Appropriate Design Code, which started in the UK, it recently passed in California, but I think is an effort to be opinionated, but also principles-based. So recognizing that what it looks like to protect children and their privacy on a social network is going to look different than what it looks like in a retail store or in lots of different or in a messaging app or in lots of different contexts, and really saying here's what we're aiming for, and in a way that's concrete and actionable and can be translated.
Right. Yeah, and that really brings forward this conversation to me about language, right? And that these multi-stakeholder groups are all using this language differently. And it's something that we talk a lot about with risk communications. And so you sort of see this in the consent frameworks, but you also see this in the sort of value and risk descriptions. Value for whom? Risk to whom of what? Are we more concerned about what's being hidden using privacy, or are we more worried about what's being shared? And I think there are a lot of tensions there in sort of how the lawyers use those words, how the engineers use that language, and how the public uses that language. I mean, we can even look at words like bias, which mean one thing to statisticians who are writing machine learning algorithms, and it means something fundamentally different to the general public. And so I think somehow unpacking some of this language ends up being a really important driver for how we write good policy and how we implement that policy. I guess we're running short on time, but how would you best incorporate those challenges in language and in definition? How do we get a better shared understanding there?
So I think fundamentally, communication is a real challenge in the space because everybody's starting from a different place. Even the word privacy. We've done research. I mean, we actually have published it, and it's on our research website. But what do people mean when they talk about privacy? What do they care about? It actually varies, and we built a taxonomy which helps us make decisions internally about what are the different risks that people might be worried about when they talk about their privacy. And so I think that actually it's kind of two pieces. One is actually being really thoughtful about the communication itself, whether that's communication in the policy space or communication to people. And recognizing, every time you go to a website in Europe, you get a thing that says, there are cookies here and you have to consent to them. Everyone uses websites, so everyone consents to the cookies. But it's not clear that that's, how to go back to our earlier discussion, how the cookies are used can matter quite a lot. And so actually thinking about communicating about outcomes rather than this is a technology that you need to know and consent to, I would think about, if you use this website, the information will be used in the following ways, and here are the choices that you have about that. And focusing on the things that are not expected. So, every website uses cookies for a whole range of purposes, some of which are just typical of every website, some of which are unusual, and really focusing on talking about the stuff that people wouldn't expect. I think that's really important. The second thing that I'll say, which I just don't think there's any substitute for, is actually, in the way that we talked about before about talking to governments and experts and engineers, I think it's also talking to people, the people who are actually using products and services whose data is being used and understanding, hey, when we put this in front of you, do you understand what this means? What do you take from it? And I don't think there's any, those of us who spend their days professionally thinking about data and privacy and all these things will have one frame for it. But I've learned a lot just from the exercise of putting something in front of people who care a lot about this but don't do it professionally, and seeing what they understand and don't.
Right, it's always about the humans. At the end of the day, these systems have to work for the people who are using them. So thank you so much for taking the time. And with that, I would like to bring up our final panel, the engineering team and group. So please, if we can give Rob a hand of applause, and then.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. This is a really important subject and a really important approach to it. And as Aneesh talked to us this morning about, we have not made good progress here. We've not even been top of mind to people. But what we're doing is incredibly important. And Ellie and Rob pointed out to us in the session just passed, it's been 15 years, first of all, to get the word data privacy into the State of the Union address. We should be ashamed of ourselves, and our government should be ashamed of itself. But we have an opportunity now. So here's a window of an opportunity. So we have a one-time opportunity for a limited time only to move this forward. And if we're going to move it forward, the policy panel did a great job. By the way, on panel appeal, forgot to do that. The policy panel did a great job of talking about the need for policy and how we go about it and how we get started. And we have to get started. And everybody has been waiting to figure out where to put their step first. Where's the first step? I don't know, I don't care. Just make a step. Let's go. So we go forward. But as we go forward on a policy perspective, we actually have to do it. And here are the doers. And so I'm going to start off with, I'm going to ask each of our panelists here, we have a very esteemed set of panelists here, to both introduce themselves. And then I want you to tell me, what is top of mind? What is top of mind to you around data privacy? And can you give me and us a discrete example of a solution to the data policy and privacy issue, whether it worked or not? A solution. So I'm going to start with Robbie.
With me?
Yes, you.
Thank you. Okay. I thought we were going this way. But anyway,
Doing it, I
thank
am.
you so much for I like randomness. That's really good. So I'm Kobe Nissim. I'm local. I'm a professor here at the Department of Computer Science, but I'm also affiliated with the law school. I'm a computer scientist. I'm not a lawyer. And I've been working on privacy for about a little more than 2 decades now. My background is in theoretical computer science, and my PhD thesis was in cryptography and secure computing. And cryptography is this field where, like in the late 70s, there was nothing but a revolution in the way we do crypto. It kind of turned from kind of an art to a field, a scientific field that has mathematical foundations, and we have been thinking about definitions, and we've been mathematical definitions of cryptographic concepts, and we've been building them and making concise assumptions on whenever we need to do that, and we've been proving that systems are secure and so on. And when I came to started thinking about privacy, I kind of expected the field to be similar, and it turned out that it was very different. Like looking at papers from the 70s up in the privacy literature, when I started working on this in 2002, I could not find those definitions, and it was not clear what actually, I could see a lot of techniques, but it was not clear what was the purpose of this technique and what they are protecting against and so on. And with a group of researchers, we started thinking of how to put privacy on sound mathematical grounds in the same, similar way to what happened in cryptography just in the late 70s. And this line of work, on one hand, introduced concepts that I think are going to be useful, like differential privacy. We invented differential privacy and introduced it in 2006, and it's a concept that began just in the theoretical world, but now is beginning to have impact on the real world. And also this scientific mathematical study of privacy has taught us a lot of other things, and also brought a lot of, or at least some, bad news. And I think the biggest one is what we call composition in our jargon, which means what happens when you compute with privacy over the same or similar data or data of the same population again and again and again, and you produce new insights. And the unfortunate reality, mathematical reality, is that this erodes privacy over time, even if what you're computing are aggregates like statistics, machine learning models, and so on. And this is kind of a mathematical fact that we cannot get around, which tells us we have to balance things here. There is the utility you want to get from the data, and everybody understands this utility, and then there are the privacy risks that grow as we make more and more use of the data. And if we want to preserve privacy, we'll have to, in some sense, hamper utility. And one of the first examples of this was in the theoretical work I did with Graeden in 2006, which introduced a concept that we call reconstruction attacks. Reconstruction attacks are attacks that use the legitimate access to a mechanism. In our case, it was a system that produces statistics, and maybe to protect, to give privacy protection, maybe it introduces noises or inaccuracies in the computation. And yet we showed that it was possible to access this mechanism that only provides information about large populations with noise and reconstruct the underlying data very accurately. And this is a phenomena that initially was only shown in theoretical papers, but later on in the last few years also in practice. So I think what we've seen, what I've seen in this 20-something years working on this is, yes, you can create sound foundational basis for talking about privacy. You need to be very careful to make clear what you are talking about, because privacy is this huge problem. If you put 10 experts in the room, you will get 20 answers to the question what you think privacy is. And this is one of the reasons I think we should call concepts like differential privacy. It's not it doesn't relate to the entire privacy problem, but it carves out a significant portion of it. But there are a lot of other things to be done, and we can slowly build this math, and over time it may also turn into technology. And this is reassuring. Another thing I've been doing in the last 8 or so years is starting to look at privacy policy and beginning to realize that privacy is actually not a concept, not a technical concept originally. It's a concept that comes from philosophy and political science and law and other areas. And then now it also has a technical phase to it, and we have to deal with a technical phase. And one important question is this really the same thing? Like if the fact that we call differential privacy, does it mean that it's about privacy? If that's how it works, let's call it differential giraffes, and we'll have now a theory about giraffes, right? The same theory, by the way. And it can't be that this is the answer. So there is a question of how do we make sure that the technical solutions that we provide and the theory that develop actually talk about the real thing, about privacy, as it's being understood in regulation, in the philosophical thinking, and so on. And this is a challenge that I see. I've been working with legal scholars over the last 8 years. I remember the first meetings, one of the first meetings I told them I heard a survey that said only in the US there are about more than 2,000 privacy regulations, and they told me, oh, don't worry about it, there are a lot of duplicates, it's only 1,200, okay? I don't know how to work technically with so many regulations and analyze their effect, and I would guess that many others don't either. And so part of what I'm trying to do now is to see how we develop methodologies to bridge between this legal thinking about privacy and the technical thinking about privacy. And one of the things you see started to look into it is that actually we've been working in very divergent ways, although we're using the same terms, okay? But we mean the same words mean very different things. We're using very different arguments, and we have very different goals in these two disciplines. So how do we bridge them? And again, coming from the mathematical background, maybe one of my goals is to see if we can maybe create legal theorems. Okay, the same way we do. We have mathematical theorems. Can we prove mathematically that technology satisfies or does not satisfy the requirements of a legal standard? And we have some successes in this direction. I'll be happy to tell about them. I just don't want to take too much time. And to your last question, one thing that I'm thinking about and worried about is that whether we're participating in kind of a privacy theater and a kind of and the technology and all the good things and good intentions are kind of in some way wasted on doing a privacy theater, and also kind of bars us from thinking about another question. What if we are losing privacy? What do we do then? Do we understand what privacy was supposed to give us? What kind of value it brings to society? And can we develop policies and technology in order to compensate for this loss of privacy? I think this is something that we are at large missing in the discussion. There's been some work in theoretical computer science in the last decade or so on fairness and discrimination, which I think goes in this direction, because if fairness and discrimination are issues that we thought privacy deals with, even if we don't get privacy, maybe we can integrate that into our systems. So this is a big question that I think is currently like, what do we do if we lose privacy? I'm not saying that we should stop working on developing privacy technology and privacy policy, but I think we should also inject into the discussion this question.
Thank you, Robbie. So, Mallory, as Robbie pointed out to us, this is not a 20-second solution. He's been working on it for decades. So can you, A, introduce yourself, and then tell us a little bit about what is top of mind to you around data privacy and importantly, the actual, it's not the policy is important, for sure. What we call it is a big deal. And Robbie's right. We use the same words, we mean something entirely different, which is a barrier to just getting something on paper. But something around an actual solution.
Yeah, I can make an attempt. So I'm Mallory Nodal. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm also a member of the Internet Architecture Board, where I think best describe my work at the CDT as being one of multi-stakeholder internet governance. So I appreciate the approach here to be multi-stakeholder. I think it's a good approach. And then, at CDT, then we have a program that's largely focused on the open internet and what that means, as preserving it in the way that it operates now as a public good. And it's very much sort of the underlying basis for a lot of the conversation we're having here. So I would describe then the sort of three things we focus on as being to preserve end-to-end encryption and also make it more ubiquitous as a tool or as a mechanism for providing privacy, or as I like to think of it, data protection. It's another synonym that I think is a little bit more specific in what that means. The second area is around minimizing the harms of targeted web advertising, or working on web advertising more generally, and as well as coming up with or supporting other models for advertising that aren't so privacy invasive. And then the last one is around interoperability, which is actually probably more related right now in the moment to the first question around encryption, as we think that interoperability is, for its own sake, really important, even though currently there's legislation that is sort of invoking principles of interoperability for the purposes of antitrust and competition. We've, for a long time, talked about the importance of interoperability as an architecture, and so are currently working on that. I'll have to check my notes. But I think that some examples, right? I think that there's some good examples that have made major privacy gains in the recent past around private end-to-end, or I would say private is actually redundant, end-to-end encrypted messaging that is feature-rich and that's usable and that's allowing more and more people to not just have confidential conversations, but have actually a whole variety and range of ways to communicate with not just their friends and loved ones, but businesses and practitioners, doctors, bankers. Maybe that's not as popular here, but in parts of the global South and other places, over-the-top services that use end-to-end encryption are used for everything. And so that's been really fantastic. And I think it actually, though, speaks to this tension now that we're talking about interoperable forms of communication that have been around for a long time, but kind of don't work well. And why aren't those interoperable messaging systems that predate end-to-end encrypted messaging being used? My main example of that is email. It was mentioned before that one doctor could send the other a file now through encrypted email. It is incredibly difficult to use for end users. If you've ever tried to get OpenPGP running on an email client, it's tough. I wouldn't recommend it to my next door neighbor, but in some cases maybe it makes sense. And so thinking about how then the sort of walled garden or the completely inoperable, but you have all control of the ecosystem has really worked for users of tools in terms of the features that are offered and the main one obviously then being encryption, but then also then how that's being challenged in policy. And we won't talk about policy, but as somebody who is focused on the technology, I do spend then a great deal of time worried about the policy challenges to the use of end-to-end encryption, which are bubbling up very specifically right now in the UK, the EU, and it's sometimes in the US even. Another, I think, example, I'm going to switch now to talk about web advertising, because that's another thing that I mentioned we focus on a lot.
Now, before you leave end-to-end encryption, which I think is this is really important, and it was brought up earlier today about the ability to move sensitive information, i.e. private data, across. So end-to-end encryption was an engineering solution to that.
Yes.
Were there unintended consequences from the end-to-end? It solved one problem. Did it create another?
So it depends on who you ask and kind of what problems we're talking about. But I do think that it creates an environment of constraint. And those constraints are important. And this is one of the areas of inquiry and research in the interoperable space that I'm curious about. And as well as building out more features. So for example, if we want people to feel safe, if we want to make sure there is accountability for the folks using these apps that for criminal purposes or other things, we need to think about more features that still fit within the constraint of it being an end-to-end secure communication that don't break the promise of the privacy and confidentiality features of end-to-end encryption. So I can go on, but maybe just really briefly, if you're going to use user reporting, say you're using an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, and someone sends you a piece of content that you don't want, or it's from a user that you don't know, how do you block and report them in a way that is privacy respecting, because you also don't want these reporting and blocking mechanisms to be retaliatory or abused in and of themselves. So how do you create that feature such that the central service knows something about it and can help you mitigate that threat as an end user, but in a privacy-preserving way that doesn't actually break the confidentiality of the communication? That's not a straightforward problem, but people have worked on it. There's ways that folks are trying out, but there's a whole slew of possible mitigations that would then need to fit within the constraints of that confidential system. So yeah, another one then on privacy respecting web advertising. I think a good example, well, we're trying to actually generate examples of web advertising that can be done in a way that the end users don't feel is being targeted at them. Because I think there's a pervasive sense that, well, this is the sort of model that we have to live with, but it makes me feel a little uncomfortable. I have no way to avoid it if I want to participate in social media or other kinds of online civic life, so we just sort of tacitly accept it. But that isn't entirely true, because I think there are examples already in use of advertising that doesn't use user data, or that doesn't target the user with ads in a way that still allows for innovation and commerce, and so that users also feel like they're getting interesting products and things like that. So let me get specific. So one is contextual advertising. So if I'm doing a search or actually actively looking for something, that is then sort of consent to, please show me ads, please show me content that actually really properly fits the terms I'm looking for. If I'm reading an article about a subject, it might indicate that I would then want to see an ad for this. So it's more based on the content being accessed, less about the person accessing it. And then the last one I'll share, which I just learned about, and I will call out the company. I try not to do that, but it's because I didn't learn about it directly from them. I was reading an article in the New Yorker. Netflix used to use a really complicated algorithm to try to figure out what you wanted to watch, specifically us, right? And they don't do that anymore. In fact, they kind of laugh it off as being like, oh, we were so silly back then, because what they do now is they scoop up what you want to watch so that they can make the best TV possible, so that they can improve their product and create television shows and movies that everybody wants to watch based on watching preferences. So they still use that user data, but they're not using it to target you. They're using it because it helps them build better products. And that, to me, seems like something that we all sort of benefit from. And I would love to hear more models about that as we sort of push back against the whole sort of architecture itself. So those are a couple of examples, because I know you wanted specific examples, but I'll just end by talking about the kinds of things that are on my mind. And mostly this has come, so this is why I'm reading notes, because it's mostly come from what everybody has said so far. Everybody who's been able to speak has really been inspiring to me and helped me reframe some of these issues. I think one of the things that I worry about a lot is the sort of architectural design between an API versus approach that has been invoked and mentioned before versus a sort of revisiting or re-architecting it from the ground up approach. And I don't actually think that we should think of it as an either or. I think we should really look for ways that we can do both depending on the situation. And so some examples are, if we do interoperable end-to-end encryption, an API approach would be a horrible idea because obviously that would then break that sort of end-to-end architecture because you'd have to have a middle. So that's out, right? There may be other things like that where we really want to reject the idea that we need to do an API. I was going to sort of push back on that idea that Venmo's great. I resent having to use Venmo because I've lived in Canada, I've lived in Kenya, I've lived in the UK, and you can send people money without another app because the banking system in those countries, and I think most countries, actually lets you do that directly, right? And so there are things that maybe it's a good idea to just tear it all down, rebuild it from the ground up with the right stakeholders in the room to figure out a solution that's more elegant. Maybe that's just my bias. I find the protocol or the redesign a little bit more elegant. And I think I'll stop there. So thanks again.
Thank you, Mallory. Yes, elegance is always welcomed in the room. So Alyssa, I'm going to turn to you here and ask you to, again, tell us what is top of mind to you around, first introduce yourself, and then tell us what's top of mind to you around data privacy and something around from a solution perspective to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'll be last, obviously.
Happy to be here. Sorry, Mark. So I'm Alyssa Cooper. I'm Vice President of Ecosystem Engineering and a fellow at Cisco Systems, the big IT company, not the food company. So what I do at Cisco is I work to shape how we engage in what we call technology ecosystems. So technical standardization, open source communities, external research partnerships, and co-innovation with other industry partners, all in service of thinking about how do we do long-term technology incubation that will benefit the industry and will benefit our particular portfolio. I've also previously worked in our collaboration technology group, which is the part of the company that sells voice, video, messaging. If anybody's used WebEx, that's like our signature product there, competitor for Teams and Zoom and all the other applications that we've gotten used to using during COVID. In my career, I've spent a lot of time, about more than 15 years, working and thinking about the architecture of the internet, the protocols that we use to build the internet, and how the design of those protocols and that architecture furthers the empowerment of end users, supports privacy, and increases connectivity across the globe. So I kind of got into this work through privacy as a gateway drug, and then have expanded out since then to think about many other aspects of the design of the internet. So I will start with a couple of examples from that experience that I do think are true success stories, and I will caution you that I'm kind of a cynic and a renegade a little bit in thinking about what the lessons are that we draw from this experience. So be prepared. The first one I'm going to talk about is the initiative to encrypt the web. So if you go back to 2013, 2014, something like 30% of connections between users' browsers on the one end and websites and servers on the opposite end of those connections were encrypted on the wire. So if I was an eavesdropper in these connections, about 30% of the time, I wouldn't be able to decipher the traffic that was going back and forth between myself and the Cisco website or the Google website or the New York Times website. But for 70% of the connections, those were in the clear, and any passive eavesdropper would be able to see all of the data going back and forth. So this is, you can think about this as, when you have the lock icon or what used to be the green lock icon in your browser, that's how you know that this connection is protected. And there were some important events that occurred in 2013, namely the disclosures that Edward Snowden made about mass surveillance on the internet. So prior to 2013, I was a person who had worked on privacy, on thinking about this very data leaky architecture that we had for the internet, because if we go back 40, 50 years to when the internet was first designed, it was all people who knew each other and trusted each other. So we didn't actually design the fundamentals of the internet to protect data in transit because of course, this is a network that has 64 nodes on it. It's never going to get that big. We all trust each other. We don't need to encrypt anything. That design showed its age quite quickly. But as somebody who cared about privacy and was working to try to change some of these things, it was really an uphill battle. There's a lot of ease of use that comes from having all this data accessible to you in the clear, not just on the endpoints, but as the operator of networks. When you can see every bit of traffic that's going across your network, it facilitates a lot of ease of use in terms of how you manage and control that network. So trying to say, hey, we should really shield more of this data, or we shouldn't be sending so much data back and forth just to effectuate a communication between two endpoints on the internet was really an uphill battle. That changed significantly after the Snowden disclosures, because there was suddenly this revelation that this architecture that we built was being massively exploited for a purpose to which many, many citizens and consumers felt was out of line, right? Was not in line with expectations, as was discussed previously. And it also had a big impact on the companies that were implicated by these disclosures, that suddenly there was a sort of branding and competitive imperative to change this. The other thing that happened in this time frame, sort of starting 2014, was that the tools that are needed for any given website out of the millions and billions of websites that are out there to be able to more easily deploy encryption on the server side became much easier to use. There was a widespread industry effort to make the certificates that we use for web encryption freely available. So if you've heard of Let's Encrypt, that's a certificate authority that you can now, any website can go and get a free certificate from it. And the automation needed to effectuate all of that on the server side became much simpler. So the combination of a sort of push from the browser side and from the big companies that were serving web traffic and the automation and ease of use of these tools, and that drive, that competitive and branding drive to encrypt the web, in short order, say by 2017, 2018, more than 90% of connections on the web became encrypted, and that remains true today. So this is like a very stark difference that you can look and say, previously, were we protecting people's privacy? Not really. We were doing not a great job. Are we doing it today? Absolutely. The web is a different place today than it was 10 years ago on this one particular aspect of privacy. And all of this, again, not driven by policy, right? Driven entirely by other factors out there. And this was not mandated. It was not required by any regulator. I mean, it's required in certain regulated verticals, but in terms of the web, the broad-based web itself, not mandated by any policy. The other example that I'll give is user tracking on the web and on mobile applications. So if we go back to 2017, Safari launched something called Intelligent Tracking Protection, which by default restricts the use of third-party cookies on the web by parties on the server side. So I think people are probably familiar with third-party cookies, a really important mechanism that advertisers and other companies that do tracking make use of in order to be able to continuously re-identify that this is the same user as they go from site to site, service to service, and to build profiles of these users in order to be able to target them. So starting in 2017, we started to see the browsers put up more shields to defend against this kind of tracking. Safari in 2017, Firefox in 2019, and then in 2021, we saw this same concept come to the mobile app ecosystem when Apple deployed app tracking transparency. And the important feature that all of these steps had in common was that they were turned on by default. And I think this is true of Apple. I mean, Apple pops a consent screen, but they say, do you want to be tracked? And everybody says no. And so essentially, you can consider that these protections are turned on by default. They don't require, again, not mandated by policy, not requiring the user to go search around in some complicated set of menus and figure it out. They don't require anybody to install an extension into the browser. None of these things. This is a privacy protection that is silently in the background, serving users every day on all of those platforms. And again, driven by competitive differentiation. So I talked about Safari, I talked about Mozilla. I believe there's actually similar protections in Microsoft Edge now. Those companies have a branding and a profile that they want to put out there in terms of being the privacy saviors, right? They're out there to protect the user. They're a user agent. They're actually trying to serve the user's interest. There's one that I didn't name, which is Chrome, and Chrome does not block third-party cookies by default. I'm not putting you on the spot. I know it's not your job. But so what do we learn? What are the common themes across both of these examples, right? Is that you can actually make meaningful privacy improvements. They don't need to be driven by policy. I previously worked more on the policy side. It has been not 15 years, 25 years waiting for federal privacy legislation. Stop waiting. Even when it comes, it wouldn't effectuate these kinds of protections, right? These things that actually help people today and are helping everybody on the web today, federal privacy legislation isn't gonna get you this. So you can do these things when there's a competitive drive to do so. And the most important thing is that you turn them on by default and you give people these protections silently without making them hop through consent screens and get pop-up fatigue and all these other things. You don't put the burden on the user. You take the burden on as the service provider. So what's top of mind for me today is finding more opportunities to follow that model and to effectuate that on the internet. I'm also working quite a bit with Mallory on interoperable end-to-end encrypted messaging, and I think this is another opportunity where we get to do that. And just to give one more layer on that, all of engineering is trade-offs. Every time we go to make something more performant, then we think about, can we still make it as secure? When we think about end-to-end encrypted messaging and voice and video, I will also say, there's lots of great functionality that we get from having centralized exposure to the data as it goes back and forth on a messaging or a voice or a video application. So for just take video as an example, transcoding, and you have multiple video streams that if you have a centralized server that can see all this data, we can get you one really nice video stream to each endpoint because we have a server doing all this processing in the middle. When you start encrypting all the data, you can't do the processing in the middle, and you have to think about how you do the processing at the ends. But I think all of this is totally feasible to do in an interoperable way for messaging and voice and video. I think the same is true for moderation and abuse, that we can put these protections at the end and have a workable system where we have both privacy and security, and we have a feature-rich ecosystem of services. And so that's something that I'm working on now and looking forward to seeing come to fruition.
So those are excellent examples, and I really, as an economist, I really appreciate the idea that privacy was driven by competitiveness, not by the government dictating or some other policy dictating, but in the absence of somebody putting a structure around it, just the competition between companies to give them a competitive edge brought them to the privacy table. And last but not least, Mark, tell us a little bit, again, tell us who you are, but tell us what's top of mind to you in this world of data privacy and your thoughts around solutions to it.
So, folks, Mark.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Yeah, sure. Mark Crandall. I am Director of Privacy and head of our privacy effort for Google Cloud.
Are you a lawyer?
I am a lawyer. I have a legal background, but I've been part of engineering for the last 10, 12 years, actually, during my time at Google. And my primary job is to try to translate the legal requirements that we will obtain from our legal peers in the legal department, from our privacy counsel, and then translate that into something that is functional, deployable, pragmatic by our engineering teams. As we learned in the policy panel earlier, you can't go to an engineer and say build something that is reasonable in terms of privacy protections. They will eat you alive. Well, what about this? What about that? How do you do this? What about that? What about this situation? What about that situation? Now, of course, we want to talk about end goals and what otherwise would be achievable and useful for our users. But at the end of the day, we need to provide something that's pragmatic and deployable and buildable by our engineering teams. So I think one of my biggest concerns right now with respect to that is translating quite stringent requirements, like those we might get out of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and then implementing those in a way that is feasible for our engineering teams. Not only that, but we do have 2,000 potential privacy frameworks. And yes, boiling it down to 1,200 is potentially of great relief, but you don't want to go to engineering colleagues with 1,200 privacy requirements. So what we typically try to do from, again, a pragmatic perspective is try to divide all of these requirements up into buckets. What are the similarities between these various frameworks? What are the differences? What are the outliers? And then how can we engineer for these similarities across these multiple frameworks? And then in terms of areas where we want to apply these controls, really these common controls across these frameworks, what areas or what data stores contain the most personal data? In other words, what do we want to look at first? Where do we have to apply these protections? Where do we get the most bang for our engineering buck in terms of focusing our resources? So we want to find commonalities across these various frameworks. We want to look at the data stores that contain personal data and the ones that contain the most personal data and the most sensitive of that data, and then focus our efforts there first of all. The second thing is to provide common frameworks across the engineering teams and common guidelines. From a scalability perspective, we have thousands of engineers at Google, and even within Google Cloud, which again is our business to business. We provide cloud services to other businesses that deploy in our systems, and productivity services like Workspace, and Gmail is the consumer-facing version of that. But how do we do that in a scalable way? And that is another thing that is top of mind for us. So first of all, we want to provide guidelines that are deployable and understandable and usable to all of our engineering and product management teams. What is personal data? How does personal data differ from personally identifiable information? How does that differ from PHI if you're looking at HIPAA? What if you have privacy requirements that are specific to a banking sector in Europe or South Africa or Brazil? So we provide overall guidelines for our engineering teams that they can use as they start developing their products and services. But then the other thing that we try to do as a privacy team, again, embedded within engineering and working with product management, is to provide arm's length guidance as the products themselves are being built and developed. And we are there to help not only provide the guidance, but also to help guide in particular directions when it comes to decisions that we may need to make when it comes to engineering realities and practicalities. So for example, at Google, we have what are called privacy working groups, which are basically teams of program managers, people with compliance backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, legal backgrounds, and our job is to serve as consultants for the engineering and product management teams. We are not embedded with those specific teams. We are at arm's length, so we can provide some sort of objective, what we would say, objective suggestions in terms of the product development process, but not slow down the teams in providing. One example I like to give is I like to say we'd like to provide the yellow light, but not necessarily the red light. In other words, our job is not to say no, but rather how can we achieve your goal without creating these privacy risks? In other words, what ultimately do you need to achieve that would allow us to help achieve that in a way that is privacy protecting, but also buildable by engineering? So again, Top of mind is translating what otherwise would be vague or difficult legal requirements into something which can be deployable specifically, doing it at scale, which means finding commonalities across different privacy frameworks and data protection frameworks, providing broader guidance so that it can be deployed or ingested by product and engineering teams, and then providing meaningful pragmatic guidance, including getting in early during the product development and design process so that pro-privacy protecting technologies can be developed and deployed during the product development lifecycle. So those are the areas that we focus on.
Thank you. This has been a great panel. I would love to carry on with them a little longer, but we are over time. And so I'm going to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and suggestions with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Ellie to bring us home with the closing remark.
So thank you all. I know we are a touch past time and just wrapping up here, but just to pull forward a couple of the really big key themes here. I mean, at the core of it, these are some of, like I said at the beginning, the very best thinkers and who are putting together the policies, crafting the policy as it needs to be, both the big P and the little p policy, and really then figuring out how we build these systems. So this hopefully is certainly not, neither is it the only conversation happening right now on these topics, nor is it going to be the last, and we will certainly be pushing forward on this and continuing it as we start to get to some federal privacy regulation. To Alyssa's point, it's not going to be the be all and end all, and ultimately we're going to have to build the systems and figure out what's possible, and then realistically the policy will follow, and then they're going to continue iterating on each other. And that's the way that good policy ends up being built and written, but also the way good engineering systems end up meeting that policy and then crafting and refining and building upon it. The whole goal here is that we can ultimately end up with a relatively sort of coherent description of what privacy is and meet both the technical and the human understanding of what privacy means and how privacy works in our world. And then to Andrew's point, expanding far beyond what is just privacy to this broader domain of data policy, because really it isn't just about privacy. It's also how do we understand and use data and use it across all of these different industries to really do the things that we want and need to be able to do in the world, while making sure that we're taking care of the humans whose data it represents and whose lives are captured in those data. So thank you all for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation and very much looking forward to the future. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.